Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to. Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to say at the outset that Labor will support the Employment Standards Legislation Bill to Select Committee. There is a range of aspects of the bill that we think need thorough discussion at the Select Committee, and our continued support after that point will be reliant on there being some significant changes to the legislation. But because it deals with a range of matters, it seems unusual that the three issues that have been brought together in this legislation have been brought together under one bill. I suspect what happened is that the Minister was intending to bring the changes regarding minimum standards. Then there was a campaign led by the Labor Party and others and fronted extremely well by Sue Moroney on paid parental leave, and the government realised they had to do something about paid parental leave, so that got tacked onto this legislation. And then there was a spectacular campaign led by the Unite Union around 0 hours contracts, and the government realised that they needed to be seen to be acting on those as well. So they've tacked these other things onto this legislation. It's a bit of a dog's breakfast, but if this is the way that we're going to get to address these issues, then so be it. So there is some valid issues that have been raised in this legislation, so we do want to see it go to Select Committee, albeit there is some work that has to be done. So I would like to focus my contribution on the issue of 0 hour contracts. Our first concern is that although the Minister promised that he would get rid of 0 hour contracts, what in fact happens with this legislation is that 0 hour contracts are legalised. What we get from this is rules for how to use 0 hour contracts, not their abolishment, which is what New Zealanders thought they were going to get. So at the moment, 0 hour contracts are of dubious legal status. Whether or not our current employment law actually allows permanent part-time agreements with no fixed hours is a matter that a lot of people have wondered whether it ought to be tested by the courts. So in a way, it's potentially restricted the use of these contracts because of that dubious legal status. This legislation gets rid of that dubious legal status and actually enshrines 0 hour contracts in the law. And we are deeply concerned about that. We think it's absolutely the opposite effect of what the Minister stated the purpose of this legislation was. So getting rid of 0 hour contracts is incredibly important. 0 hour contracts are one of the most exploitative tools in the bad employer's toolbox. Yep. They leave people at the absolute mercy of the employer as to how many hours they get from 1 week to the next. And the way they operate means that people have to be available for work whenever it is offered. They have no opportunity to turn down work. They might get 10 hours 1 week, 6 hours the next week, 15 hours the week after that, and 0 hours the week after that. But they have to be available at all times. And what we get is people who maybe have come off a benefit. They've done the right thing, they've done what the government has asked them to do. The employer makes vague promises about how many hours they're going to get, and what ends up happening is that they get far fewer hours than they were expecting. They don't get the certainty of income that they were expecting, and they end up worse off often in an employment agreement in work than they were when they were on the benefit. They might have left other jobs for this. And it doesn't just affect young people. The people who I've found most moving to talk to are parents, often sole parents, who are trying to make ends meet, who are trying to provide for their children, who are trying to put food on the table, to pay the rent, to save some money, and they just can't do it without the certainty of guaranteed hours. When there's competition for rentals, then the tenancy agent will say, well, can you show us how much you earn from 1 week to the next? And people on 0 hours contracts can't do that, let alone try and go to the bank and get a mortgage, where likewise they don't have a chance of doing that on a 0 hours contract. So the government is right to say that we've got to do something about this. But what we actually need is real change that actually gets rid of zero-hour contracts, not enshrining them in the law. Now, the Minister says that those people who are expected to be available will be paid compensation by their employer. How much compensation? That's not in the legislation. Will it be money? That's not in the legislation. Exactly how is this going to work, Minister? Does the Minister expect that people will be able to bargain for good levels of compensation in their employment agreement? Well, we're talking about people on 0 hours contracts. These are the most vulnerable workers in our society. The people who are offered 0 hour contracts and have to take them or leave them. It's ridiculous to expect people in that situation to be able to bargain for reasonable compensation for being expected to be on call. So then we've got the issue of shift cancellation. And again, what we've actually being offered here in the legislation is worse than the status quo. At the moment, basic contract law says that if you are offered work and you show up for that work, you have completed your part of the bargain. If the employer then says that work's not available, they have not met their obligations under basic contract law, and they would be obliged to pay you for the work that you agreed to do and which they offered you. Under this legislation, there could be a clause included in people's agreements where those shifts could be cancelled and they would get, again, compensation. But how much compensation? And will it be money? Will the employer be able to say, I've cancelled your shift, would you like fries with that? Because that's the situation we could be facing, Mr. Speaker. So, in a lot of ways, this legislation is going to leave vulnerable workers in a worse situation than they're already in. We might see employers saying, actually, you don't have an 8-hour shift, you have a series of 2-hour shifts, so that they can limit their liability for cancelling shifts at short notice. There's too many gaps in this legislation as it is written right now. I think actually this is legislation that increases flexibility, it increases the opportunities for exploitation, dressed up as something which is supposed to make workers safer and more secure at work. It does the exact opposite of what the government has been telling us it is supposed to do. Sir, it's good to see again that the government is considering the issue of restrictions on secondary employment, the so-called restraint of trade clauses. But again, under our current law, we already have quite tight restrictions on when restraint of trade clauses can be used. We are concerned that the way the legislation is currently worded actually makes it possible for an employer to include more pervasive, more wide restraint of trade clauses that capture more alternative forms of work than what is currently possible under the current legislation. So we need to have a good look at all of those things. Most importantly, we need to have a clear separation of casual agreements and permanent agreements, whether they're part-time or whether they're full-time. This legislation blurs those lines even more than what we already have. There may be some things that we can do about this, sir, and I'd like to offer two possible ways forward before my time is up. First of all, we could look at what Unite has achieved through their collective bargaining with the fast food industry and look at setting guaranteed hours based on what people ordinarily work. So you might have an initial period where there are no guaranteed hours, and then after that, people have to get guaranteed hours based on what they normally work. That is essentially how those collective agreements bargained by Unite work. We could look at enshrining that in the law. The other thing is we could look at casual loading, so that if you want to put someone on a casual agreement, you actually have to pay a little bit more for that. If you don't want to pay more, then you have to give people guaranteed hours, so that there is a clear distinction between casual agreements and permanent agreements that give people guaranteed hours. Sir, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to this legislation if it is to get the support of the whole House throughout the whole process, and if we are to be sure that it is legislation that will actually make vulnerable workers more secure at work. At the moment, we fear that this will actually make vulnerable workers more insecure and will do the exact opposite of what the government has promised. But we're prepared to work with the government to make it work properly.